Last time we spoke about the Battle of Nanjing. In December of 1937, as the battle for Nanjing unfolded, terror hit its residents, seeking safety amidst the turmoil. General Tang Shongju rallied the Chinese forces determined to defend against the advancing Japanese army. Fierce fighting erupted at the Gate of Enlightenment, where the determined Chinese soldiers resisted merciless assaults, with tragedy looming. By mid-December, the Japanese made substantial advances, employing relentless artillery fire to breach Nanjing's defenses. Leaders called for strategic retreats, yet amidst the chaos and despair, many young Chinese soldiers driven by nationalism continued to resist. By December the 13th, Nanjing succumbed to the invaders, marking a tragic chapter in history. As destruction enveloped the city, the resilience of its defenders became a poignant tale of courage amidst the horrors of war, forever marking Nanjing as a symbol of enduring hope in the face of despair. This episode is the Nanjing Massacre. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we just began a brand new miniseries covering the Greco-Persian Wars. And this miniseries features a guest speaker who just did his PhD on the Battle of Salamis. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest episode in the exclusive series is actually not about history. It's looking at Lord of the Rings. To be more precise, what was Sauron's strategy to win the War of the Ring? I really do recommend it, so please go check it out. So, obvious disclaimer, today we're going to be talking about arguably one of the most horrific war atrocities ever committed. To be blunt, it may have been worse than some of the things we talked about during the fall of the Ming Dynasty, when bandit armies raped and pillaged cities, and there was a hell of a lot of cannibalism going on. The Nanjing Massacre, as it's become known, is very well documented by both Chinese and foreign sources. There is an abundance of primary sources, many well verified. It's going to be extremely graphic. I am going to try and tell it to the fullest. So if you've got a weak stomach, perhaps sit this one out. You have been warned. Qin Yuding began evacuating his troops from the area surrounding the Gate of Enlightenment before dawn on December the 13th. En route to sigh, he took the time to visit a dozen of his soldiers housed in a makeshift hospital located in an old cemetery. These men were too severely injured to participate in the evacuation, and Chen had to leave them with only a few words of encouragement. Little did he know, within days they would all perish in their beds, victims of the Japanese forces. Upon arriving in Shaoguan later that morning, Chen was met with some grim news. His divisional commander had crossed the Yangtze River with his chief of staff the previous afternoon. Now he was on his own. He didn't linger near the riverside chaos, quickly realizing there was nothing he could do there. Instead, he chose to move downstream, hoping to find a secure spot for himself and his soldiers to wait out the next few days before devising an escape strategy from the war zone. Now, he was fortunate, for soon the Japanese would live up to their notorious reputation developed during their advance from Shanghai. They were not inclined to take prisoners. That afternoon, several hundred Chinese soldiers arrived at the northern end of the safety zone. The committee responsible for the area stated that they could offer no assistance. In a misguided attempt to boost morale, they suggested that if the soldiers surrendered and promised not to engage in combat, the Japanese would likely show them merciful treatment. This optimism was woefully misplaced. Later that day, Japanese troops entered the zone, dragging out 200 Chinese men, the majority of them being soldiers, for execution just outside the city. On December 13th, Japanese soldiers started patrolling the riverbank, shooting at anything and anyone floating downstream. Their comrades aboard naval vessels in the river cheered them on, applauding each time they struck another helpless victim in the water. Civilians were not spared either. While traveling through the downtown parts of Nanjing, as the battle concluded, Labby observed dead men and women every 100 or 200 yards or so, most of them shot in the back. A long line of Chinese men marched down the street, numbering in hundreds, all destined for death. In a cruel twist, they were compelled to carry a large Japanese flag. They were herded into a vacant lot by a couple of Japanese soldiers, and as recalled by American correspondent Archibald Steele, there they were brutally shot dead in small groups. One Japanese soldier stood over the growing pile of corpses, firing into any bodies that showed any movement. The killings commenced almost immediately after the fall of Nanjing. The victorious Japanese spread out into the city streets, seeking out victims. Those unfortunate enough to be captured faced instant execution or were taken to larger killing fields to meet a grim fate alongside other Chinese prisoners. Initially, the Japanese targeted former soldiers, whether real or imagined, but within hours, the scope of victims expanded to include individuals of all age groups and genders. By the end of the first day of occupation, civilian bodies littered the streets of downtown Nanjing at a rate of roughly one per block. The defenseless and innocent were subjected to murder, torture, and humiliation in a relentless spree of violence that persisted for 6 harrowing weeks. At the time of the attack, Nanjing felt eerily abandoned. Houses stood boarded up, vehicles lay toppled in the streets, and once ubiquitous rickshaws had vanished. However, hundreds of thousands remained hidden indoors, seeking refuge. The most visible sign of the city's new rulers was a display of the Japanese flag. On the morning of December the 14th, the rising sun flag was hoisted across the city, seen in front of private homes, businesses, and public buildings. Many of these flags were hastily made, often a simple white sheet with a red rag affixed, hoping to be spared. As the days progressed, horrifying accounts of violence began to emerge. A barber, the sole survivor amongst 8 people in his shop when the Japanese arrived, was admitted to a hospital with a stab wound that had nearly severed his head from his body, damaging all muscles at the back of his neck down to his spinal canal. A woman suffered a brutal throat wound, while another pregnant woman was bayoneted in her abdomen, resulting in the death of her unborn child. A man witnessed his wife being stabbed through the heart, and then he saw his child hurled from a window to the street several floors below. These are but a few stories of individual atrocities committed. Alongside this, there were mass executions, predominantly targeting young able-bodied men, in an effort to weaken Nanjing and deprive it of any potential resistance in the future. American professor Lewis Smith recalled, "The disarmed soldier problem was our most serious one for the first 3 days, but it was soon resolved, as the Japanese shot all of them." On the evening of the 15th, the Japanese rounded up about 1,300 former soldiers from the safety zone. Binding them in groups of about 100, they marched them away in silence. A group of foreigners permitted to leave Nanjing on a Japanese gunboat accidentally became witnesses to the ensuing slaughter. While waiting for their vessel, they took a brief walk around the riverbank and they stumbled upon a scene of mass execution. Observing the Japanese shooting the men one by one in the back of the neck, as one of the foreigners recalled, "We observed about 100 such executions until the Japanese officer in charge noticed us and ordered us to leave immediately." Not all the killings were premeditated. Many occurred impulsively. A common example was when Japanese soldiers led lines of Chinese POWs to holding points, tightly bound together with ropes. Every few yards, a Japanese soldier would stand guard with a fixed bayonet aimed at a prisoner as they trudged them forward. Suddenly, one of the prisoners slipped, causing a domino effect as he fell, dragging down the men in front and behind him. The entire group soon found themselves collapsed on the ground, struggling to stand. The Japanese guards lost their patience, jabbing their bayonets into the writhing bodies until none remained alive. In one of the largest massacres, Japanese troops from the Yamada detachment, including the 65th Infantry Regiment, systematically executed between 17,000 and 20,000 Chinese prisoners from December the 15th to the 17th. These prisoners were taken to the banks of the Yangtze River near Wufushan, where they were machine gunned to death. The bodies were then disposed of by either burning or flushing them downstream. Recent research by historian Ono Kenji has revealed that these mass killings were premeditated and they were carried out systematically, in accordance with orders issued directly from one Prince Asaka. A soldier from the IJ's 13th Division described killing wounded soldiers of the Mofushan Massacre in his diary. "I figured that I'd never get another chance like this, so I stabbed 30 of the damned chinks. Climbing atop the mountain of the corpses, I felt like a real devil slayer, stabbing again and again with all of my might. Ugh, ugh," the chinks would groan. There were old folks as well as kids, but we killed them, lock, stock, and barrel. I also borrowed a buddy's sword and I tried to decapitate some. I've never experienced anything so unusual. Frequently, the Japanese just left their victims wherever they fell. Corpses began to accumulate in the streets, exposed to the elements and the onlookers. Cars constantly were forced to run over corpses. Corpses were scavenged by stray dogs, which in turn were consumed by starving people. The water became toxic. Workers in the safety zone discovered ponds clogged with human remains. In other instances, the Japanese gathered their machine-gunned or bayoneted victims into large heaps, doused them in kerosene, and set them ablaze. Archibald Steele wrote for the Chicago Daily News on December 17th, "I saw a grisly scene at the North Gate, where what was once a group of 200 men had become a smoldering mass of flesh and bones, so severely burned around the neck and the head that it was difficult to believe he was human." During the chaos in the beginning, whereupon the Japanese had not yet fully conquered the city, its defenders scrambled desperately to escape before it was too late. Individually or in small groups, they sought vulnerabilities in the enemy lines, acutely aware that their survival hinged on their success. Months of conflict had trained them to expect no mercy if captured. Previous experiences had instilled in them the belief that a swift death at the hands of the Japanese would be a fortunate outcome. On December the 12th, amidst intense artillery fire and aerial bombardment, General Tang Xiongzhi issued the order for the troops to retreat. However, conflicting directives and a breakdown in discipline transformed the ensuing events into disaster. While some Chinese units successfully crossed the river, a far greater number were ensnared in the widespread chaos that engulfed the city. In their desperation to evade capture, some Chinese soldiers resorted to stripping civilians of their clothing, disguised themselves, while many others were simply shot by their supervisor units as they attempted to flee. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of individual escape stories emerged from this period. In some rare instances, entire units, even up to divisional in strength, successfully infiltrated Japanese lines to reach safety. For others, such as the 156th Division, there were detailed plans outlining escape routes from Nanjing. Several soldiers and officers adhered to the 3-day trek, skillfully evading Japanese patrols until they reached Ningguo, located south of the capital. Nonetheless, these cases were exceptions. The vast majority of soldiers from China's defeated army faced significant risk, and they were more likely to be captured than escape. Some of Chiang Kai-shek's most elite units suffered near total annihilation. Only about 1,000 soldiers from the 88th Division managed to cross the Yangtze River safely, as did another 1,000 from the Training Division, while a mere 300 from the 87th Division survived. Even for units like the 156th Division, the escape plans were only effective for those who learned of them. These plans were hurriedly disseminated through the ranks as defeat loomed, leaving mere chance to determine who received the information. Many stayed trapped in Nanjing, which had become a fatal snare. One day, Japanese soldiers visited schools within Nanjing's safety zone, aware that these locations sheltered many refugees. They called for all former soldiers to step forward, promising safety in exchange for labor. Many believed that the long days of hiding were finally coming to an end, and they complied with this request. However, they were led to an abandoned house where they were stripped naked and bound together in groups of 5. Outside, a large bonfire had been ignited. They were then bayoneted. While still alive, some of them, they were thrown onto the flames. Only a few managed to escape and share the horrifying tale. The Japanese were, of course, well aware that numerous soldiers were hiding in Nanjing, disguised as civilians, evidenced by the piles of military uniforms and equipment accumulating in the streets. Consequently, they initiated a systematic search for soldiers within hours of taking control. The safety zone was not spared, as the Japanese army suspected that Chinese soldiers had sought refuge there. On December the 16th, they raided Jilin College, despite a policy prohibiting the admission of men, except for the elderly residents in a designated dining room. The soldiers brought axes to force open the doors that were not immediately complied with, and positioned 6 machine guns upon the campus, prepared to fire at anyone attempting to escape. Ultimately, they found nothing. In cases where they did encounter young men of military age, the soldiers lined them up, scrutinized them for distinct telltale features such as close-cropped hair, helmet marks on their chins, or shoulder blisters from carrying a rifle or pack. Many men who had never served in the military, but bore calluses from hard manual labor, were captured based on the assumption that such marks indicated military experience. As noted by George Finch, the head of Nanjing's YMCA, rickshaw coolies, carpenters, and other laborers are frequently taken. The Japanese employed additional, more cunning tactics to root out soldiers. During an inspection of a camp within the safety zone, they struggled to get the approximate 6,000 men and women to surrender. Before leaving, they resorted to one last trick. A voice screamed, "Attention!" commanded in flawless Mandarin. Many young men, conditioned by months and years of military training, instinctively responded. Even though most realized their mistake almost immediately, it was far too late. The Japanese herded them away. Given the scale of the slaughter, efforts were soon organized to facilitate the killing and disposal of many individuals as possible in the shortest amount of time. Rows of prisoners were mowed down by machine gun fire, while those injured were finished off with single bullets or bayonets. Much of the mass murder occurred near the Yangtze River, where victims could be disposed of easily by being pushed into the water, hoping the current would carry them away. As the weeks progressed and the Japanese grew increasingly concerned about the possibility of former soldiers still at large, the dragnet tightened. Beginning in late December, Japanese authorities implemented a registration system for all residents of Nanjing. At Lian College, the process lasted about a week and resulted in scenes of almost indescribable chaos, as the Japanese also decided to register residents from the surrounding areas on campus. First, the men were registered, followed by the women. Often women attended the registration to help save their husbands and sons, who would otherwise have been taken as suspected former soldiers. Despite these efforts, a total of 28 men were ultimately seized during the registration process at Lian College. Each individual who registered received a document from the authorities. However, it soon became clear that this paper provided little protection against the Japanese military. That winter in Nanjing, everyone was a potential victim. While systematic mass killings primarily targeted young men of military age, every category of people faced death in the days and the weeks following the Japanese conquest of Nanjing. Reports indicated that 50 police officers from the safety zone were executed for permitting Chinese soldiers to enter the area. The city's firefighters were taken away to meet an uncertain fate, and 6 street sweepers were killed inside their dwelling. Like an uncontrollable epidemic, the victors' bloodlust seemed to escalate continuously, seeking out new victims. When the Japanese ordered the Safety Zone Committee to supply workers for an electricity plant in Shaoguan to restore its operations, they provided 54 individuals. Within days, 43 of them were dead. Although young men were especially targeted, the Japanese made no distinctions between age or sex. American missionary John Maggie documented numerous instances of indiscriminate killings, including the chilling account of 2 families nearly exterminated. Stabbings, shootings, and rapes marked the slaughter of 3 generations of innocents, including toddlers aged 4 and 2. The older child was bayoneted while the younger was struck in the head with a sword. The only survivors were a badly injured 8-year-old girl and her 4-year-old sister, who spent the following fortnight beside their mother's decaying body. The violence was often accompanied by various forms of humiliation, as if to utterly break the spirit of the conquered people. One woman lost her parents and 3 children. When she purchased a coffin for her father, a Japanese soldier tore the lid off and discarded the old man's body in the street. Another soldier, in a drunk stupor, raped a Chinese woman and then vomited on her. In another incident, a soldier encountered a family of 6 huddled over a pot of thin rice soup. He stepped over and urinated in their pot before continuing on his way, laughing heartlessly. The atrocities committed at Nanjing were not akin to something like the Holocaust. Within places like Auschwitz, killings became industrialized and often took on an impersonal, unemotional character. The murders in Nanjing had an almost intimate quality, with each individual perpetrator bearing the blood of their victims, usually on their hands. In this sense, the Nanjing atrocities resemble the early Holocaust killings executed by the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe, prior to the implementation of gas chambers and such. How many died during the Nanjing Massacre? Eyewitnesses at the time recognized that the Japanese behavior had few immediate precedents. Missionary John Maggie compared the situation to the Turkish genocide of the Armenians during World War I, which was actually still fresh in memory at that time. Despite this, no consensus emerged regarding the exact number of fatalities, a state of affairs that would persist to this day, actually, to be honest. In his first comprehensive account of the atrocities following the conquest of the capital, New York Times correspondent Tilman Durden reported that 33 Chinese soldiers lost their lives in Nanjing, including 20,000 who were executed. Foreign correspondent Frank Oliver claimed in a 1939 publication that 24,000 men, women, and children were put to death during the first month of the city's occupation. As time progressed, much larger figures began to circulate. After returning to Germany in 1938, John Abe held a lecture where he cited European estimates between 50,000 to 60,000 people had died. In February of 1942, Chiang Kai-shek stated that 200,000 were slaughtered within 1 week. The Nanjing Tribunal, established by Chiang's government to try Japanese war criminals in 1946 and 1947, reported that more than 300,000 lives had been lost following the city's fall. The highest estimate recorded comes from a Chinese military expert who put the death toll at 430,000. Currently, the figure most commonly accepted in official Chinese media is about 300,000, a number also cited by various authors sympathetic to China's contemporary regime. The debate over the Nanjing death toll has been a complex and extensive discussion, likely to remain unresolved to everyone's satisfaction. As missionary and Nanjing University teacher Minor Cyril Bates remarked when he testified before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in July of 1946, "The scope of this killing was so extensive that no one can provide a complete picture of it." On December the 16th, American missionary Minnie Waltrin witnessed a truck passing by Jining College loaded with 8 to 10 girls. When they saw the Western woman, they cried out, "Juming, Juming," which means help, help. Waltrin felt powerless, fully aware of the fate that awaited them. As early as Tuesday of that week, she had documented rumors of girls being raped. The following night, women were taken in large numbers from their homes. Another missionary, John Maggie, wrote to his wife, "The most horrific thing now is the raping of the women, which has been going on in the most shameless way I have ever seen." A tentative list compiled by Lewis Smith detailed instances of rape occurring soon after the Japanese army entered Nanjing: 4 girls at noon on December the 14th, 4 more women that evening, 3 female refugees on the 15th, a young wife around the same time. The accounts revealed chilling individual horrors. A 15-year-old girl was taken to a barracks housing 200 to 300 Japanese soldiers and locked in a room, where she was raped multiple times a day. Victims ranged from as young as 11 to over 80. American correspondent Edgar Snow recalled, "Discards were often bayoneted by drunken soldiers. Frequently, mothers had to witness their babies being beheaded, only then to be raped themselves." YMCA head George Finch reported the case of a woman whose 5-month-old infant was deliberately smothered by a soldier to silence its cries while he raped her. Such acts were a gruesome form of humiliation designed to demonstrate the vanquished were powerless to protect their own families. A Japanese soldier named Takukoro Kozo recalled, "Women suffered the most. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being raped. We sent out coal trucks in the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women. And then each of them was allocated to 15 or 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse. After raping, we would also kill them." Women were frequently killed immediately after being raped, often through horrific mutilations such as being penetrated with bayonets, long bamboo sticks, or other objects. For instance, one 6 months pregnant woman was stabbed 16 times in the face and body, with one stab penetrating her abdomen and killing her unborn child. In another case, a young woman had a beer bottle forcibly inserted into her vagina after being raped and was subsequently shot. On December the 19th, Reverend James McCallum wrote in his diary, "I know not where to end. Never have I heard or read of such brutality. Rape, rape, rape. We estimate at least 1,000 cases a night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as they please, and do whatever they please." Rabe wrote in his diary dated December the 17th, "Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers trying to climb the wall. When I show them my party badge, they return the same way. In one of the houses in the narrow street behind my garden wall, a woman was raped and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we can take her to Kolo Hospital. Last night, up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been raped, about 100 girls at Jinling College alone. You hear nothing but rape. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're just shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and the bestiality of the Japanese soldier." In a documentary film about the Nanjing Massacre, In the Name of the Emperor, a former Japanese soldier named Shiro Azuma spoke candidly about the process of rape and murder in Nanjing. "At first we used some kinky words like pikankan. P means hip, kankan means look. Pikankan means, let's see a woman open up her legs. Chinese women didn't wear underpants. Instead, they wore trousers tied with a string. There was no belt. As we pulled the string, the buttocks were exposed. We pikankan. We looked. After a while, we would say something like, 'It's my day to take a bath,' and we took turns raping them. It would be all right if we only raped them. I shouldn't say all right, but we always stabbed and killed them because dead bodies don't talk." Without anyone to defend them, the women of Nanjing resorted to desperate measures for their safety. The young and attractive cut their hair and smeared soot on their faces to diminish their allure. Others donned boys' clothing or the garments of elderly women. However, the Japanese were well aware of these tactics, and they were not easily deceived. As American correspondent Snow described, it was an orgy of unprecedented debauchery, involving not only the lower ranks of the Japanese military, but also officers who turned their quarters into harems, bedding a new captive each night. Open-air sexual assaults were common. During the first 10 days of the occupation, groups of Japanese soldiers entered the Jilin campus 10 to 20 times daily, brandishing fixed bayonets stained with fresh blood. So overwhelmed, Valtrin decided to prioritize saving lives over salvaging possessions, spending these early days frantically moving across campus to prevent marauding soldiers from taking any women. A particularly tense situation unfolded on the evening of the 17th, when Valtrin and other staff members at Jilin College were called to the front of the campus to confront a group of Japanese soldiers. Earlier, Valtrin had received documentation from another officer affirming that the area was a legitimate refugee camp. The soldiers tore up the document in front of her. For hours, with armed Japanese soldiers encircling them, Valtrin and her colleagues were left standing or kneeling, uncertain of what awaited them. Gradually it became clear that they had been lured to the front gate so the soldiers could enter through a side entrance and abduct 12 women. As Valtrin recalled, "Never shall I forget the scene. The dried leaves rattling, the moaning of the wind, the cries of women being led away." The staff remained at the entrance until about 11 p.m., fearing that hiding soldiers might fire on them if they moved. This was not the only time that Valtrin was unable to prevent rape, a failure that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Some Japanese soldiers seeking young girls ordered middle-aged Chinese women to assist them in finding targets. When she either could or would not comply, they shot a rifle across her abdomen, narrowly missing and taking away 3 handbreadths of flesh. When the Japanese army entered Nanjing, little damage had been inflicted on the buildings, as noted by U.S. missionary John McCallum at the end of December. On the first day of their occupation, Japanese soldiers immediately dispersed into Nanjing in small groups, breaking shop windows and looting the goods within. They carried away their spoils in crates and stolen rickshaws. Initially, the looting was partly a makeshift response to the poor logistics of the Japanese army. Combat soldiers had arrived well ahead of the supply lines and faced severe food shortages until the roads reopened and the Yangtze River became navigable. Every building in Nanjing was looted and turned upside down. Everything not nailed down was stolen. Doors and window frames were removed. Safes opened with rifle shots or grenades. Japanese soldiers often pillaged property while the owners were present, threatening them with bayonets. Abandoned cars littered the streets, typically overturned and stripped of useful items, including batteries. Like Russian soldiers in Berlin 7.5 years later, the rank-and-file soldiers displayed particular interests in watches. As the scale of plunder grew, transportation became scarce. By the end of December, looting was being conducted using trucks. When vehicles were unavailable, Japanese soldiers resorted to wheelbarrows and even children's prams. Mules, donkeys, and people were also commandeered. Just as during their advance from Shanghai to Nanjing, the Chinese were forced to assist in the looting of their own homes. A common sight was a Japanese soldier leading a group of Chinese down a street laden with stolen goods. While Chinese soldiers had also engaged in some looting during the evacuation of Nanjing, it was nothing compared to the scale of the Japanese victors' plunder. The Chinese forces had deliberately avoided breaking into foreign buildings, a distinction that the Japanese disregarded. The American, British, and German embassies, alongside the ambassadors' residences, were all ransacked, stripped of everything from bedding to money and watches, rugs, and artwork. The American school was looted. Its wall was breached to remove the piano. As the Japanese stripped the city, they also began to burn it. While the winter sky could have been sparkling, it was instead filled with smoke from thousands of fires across the city. Some fires resulted from carelessness, such as when soldiers cooked meat from a stolen cow over a bonfire, accidentally igniting an ancient building. Others were acts of mindless vandalism. The Nanjing music shop saw all of its instruments and sheets piled in the streets and set ablaze. The extent of the massacre can, to some degree, be linked to a breakdown in discipline amongst Japanese soldiers. Released from weeks or months of hardship on the battlefield, many soldiers experience an intoxicating sense of freedom, resembling misbehaving boys. The deterioration of order amongst Japanese soldiers astonished those familiar with the stories of the stringent discipline within Japan's armed forces. Observers commented on soldiers laughing at proclamations from their own officers or tearing up orders and tossing them to the ground. Some foreign witnesses speculated that this lack of discipline was exacerbated by the absence of visible individual numbers on soldiers, making it challenging to identify wrongdoers. The issue also stemmed from the quality of the Japanese officer corps and their ability to manage a large army of young men, many of whom were experiencing freedom from societal constraints for the first time. Not all officers rose to the occasion. Falsehood witness an officer almost failed to prevent a soldier from raping a girl. Even worse, some officers transitioned from passive bystanders, guilty by inaction, to active participants in prolonged rape sessions. While a few attempted to instill some discipline amongst their troops, their efforts often fell short. A Japanese colonel, for instance, slapped a soldier attempting to rape a Chinese woman. Another general was seen striking a private who had bayoneted a Chinese man and threatened 2 Germans, raising questions about how much of this discipline was merely performative for the benefit of foreign observers. Ultimately, disciplinary measures had very little impact. As Rabe noted in his diary dated December the 18th, "The soldiers have almost no regard for their officers." The absence of effective higher leadership during the critical period likely exacerbated the problem. General Matsue had been suffering from malaria since November the 3rd, which left him largely incapacitated from December the 5th to the 15th. A subordinate later testified that he had been informed of instances of stealing, killing, assault, and rape, and he had become quite enraged. Although Matsue had been displeased by the unruly behavior of his soldiers, it is conceivable that his inaction led to even greater levels of atrocity than might have occurred otherwise. He insisted on holding a victory parade on December the 17th, immediately after recovering from his illness, which likely triggered a security frenzy amongst the Japanese officers concerned about the safety of Prince Asaka, uncle to Emperor Hirohito. This reaction likely prompted a surge in searches for and executions of suspected former Chinese soldiers. Japanese High Command in Tokyo was also aware of the unraveling discipline. On January the 4th of 1938, Army Headquarters sent Matsue an unusually direct message ordering him to restore control amongst his troops. Our old friend, Ishiwara Kanji bitterly criticized the situation, and he placed blame on Matsue. "We earnestly request enhancement of military discipline and public morals. The morale of the Japanese have never been on a lower level." Detachment of military police eventually arrived in Nanjing, leading to some improvements, though their presence was mixed. Some officers stationed outside the safety zone ignored atrocities occurring before them, and in some cases participated directly. At Lian College, the experience with military police was decidedly uneven. The first group of about 25 men tasked with guarding the college ended up committing rapes themselves. Despite frequent visits from Japanese soldiers in search of loot and victims to assault, the safety zone was perceived as rather successful. Many believe that both the zone and the work of its managing committee were responsible for saving countless lives. Plummer Mills, vice chairman of the committee, noted that the zone did give some protection during the fighting, but the chief usefulness of the zone has been the measure of protection it has afforded to the people since the occupation. Shortly after the Japanese conquest, the population of the safety zone swelled to 250,000 people. Around 70,000 of these were organized into 25 prearranged camps, while the majority sought accommodation wherever possible. Makeshift mat shed villages sprang up in vacant areas throughout the zone. Nanjing quickly became informally divided into two distinct cities. Outside the safety zone, the atmosphere was ghostly, with the population dwindling to around 10,000. While within the zone, bustling activity thrived. The Shanghai Road, which ran through the center of the zone, had once been a wide boulevard, and it was transformed into a hub of barter and trade, resembling a festive market during Christmas New Year, overflowing with makeshift stalls, tea shops, restaurants, making it nearly impossible to traverse by vehicle. The Japanese held a degree of respect for Westerners. Although the sentiment was not universal, it did not always offer protection. Many foreigners tried to safeguard their homes by displaying their national flags outside, but they often found that Japanese soldiers would break in regardless. To protect Lian College, American flags were displayed at 8 locations around the compound, and a large 30-foot American flag was spread out in the center. However, this proved to be of absolutely no use in preventing Japanese soldiers from entering the area. Despite this, there was some limited outright hostility towards Americans. Stronger negative sentiments were directed towards the Russians and the British, who were viewed as representatives of nations with competing interests against the Japanese Empire. The Japanese displayed particular reverence for one nationality, the Germans. Rabe would shout Deutsch or Hitler to command respect from unruly Japanese soldiers, or show them his swastika armband indicating his allegiance to the Nazi Party. Germany was seen as a rising power and rapidly becoming one of Japan's closest allies, a fellow outcast in the global politics. However, as time passed, the limits of this respect became evident. Individual soldiers began searching for women within the German embassy compound, and eventually nearly all German buildings were broken into. Despite all the challenges, there was no doubting that foreigners offered a form of protection unavailable elsewhere. Within days of the Japanese conquest, women and children began appearing in large numbers outside Abe's home, kneeling and knocking their heads on the ground as they begged to be let into his already overcrowded garden. At 1 p.m. on January the 1st, the Chinese were proclaimed rulers of their own city, or at least this was what Japanese propaganda sought to convey. On the first day of the new year, a puppet government was established in a ceremony held just north of the safety zone. A new 5-bar flag, the one associated with the early Chinese Republic, was raised, signaling a patriotic spirit and gesture of what felt unconvincing. As the new leaders took office, vowing to resurrect their city, buildings burned all around them. The ceremony marked the culmination of 2 weeks of preparatory work. As early as the 15th, General Matsue met with a local Chinese leader, referred to in the Japanese commander's diary only as Chen, who had been selected to assist in forming this new puppet government. Chen had been present in the northern part of the city of Tianjin 2 years earlier when Matsue helped establish the Chinese chapter of the Greater Asia Association there. He subscribed to Matsue's concept of Asia for Asians, but cautioned that Chinese fears of the Japanese would complicate the governance of the conquered territories. The new government aligned with the Japanese army to implement a system of indoctrination centered on conservatism, primarily targeting the youth, who were perceived as the most likely to resist. The indoctrination included messages like, "You must follow the old custom in marriage. letting your parents make arrangements for you. You must go to theaters or study English. China and Japan must become one, and then the nation will be strong. If you were deceived by these attempts to win hearts and minds, the government-sanctioned newspaper, the Xianjiangbao, or New Life Journal, was immediately dismissed as a crude vehicle for propaganda. Additionally, the government made minimal progress in more urgent tasks such as restoring peaceful time conditions and revitalizing Nanjing's economy, a challenge made formidable by the Japanese brutality. Given the fate of the first group of volunteers at the electricity plant after the conquest, no one could be found to fill the needed 40 to 45 worker slots. The same was true for the firefighters. The predictable outcomes followed. Water and limited power was restored to parts of the city by January the 2nd, but within 2 days the city was plunged back into darkness. By January the 13th, the waterworks were still non-operational, and the power supply remained intermittent, while fires continued to blaze well into January. The government was not taken seriously, struggling even with the Japanese. It quickly began to have a reputation for being venal and corrupt. One of its names was the Nanjing Autonomous Government, which a clever member of the foreign community humorously rebranded as the automatic government, reflecting its actual role as a puppet regime devoid of autonomy. While Nanjing endured its own nightmarish reality, the city's inhabitants had little understanding of the events transpiring beyond its walls. The first radio news that reached foreign residents came on January the 7th, reporting Japanese air raids on Wuhan. There was also unconfirmed rumors suggesting that Hangzhou was experiencing similar horrors to those in Nanjing, but details were scarce. It was perhaps expected that reports from afar would be limited in wartime, yet information about situations closer to Nanjing were similarly scarce, and the horrific truth gradually dawned on the city's population. A Westerner who managed to escape east from Nanjing in early January reported that all villages within a 20-mile radius had been burned to the ground. Outside the city, Japanese soldiers were randomly shooting civilians, including children. A German who drove an hour from Nanjing encountered no living souls. After the conquest, Chinese who managed to leave Nanjing reported that every pond between the city and Juyong was filled with decaying corpses of people and animals. Many of the atrocities committed during this time appeared to stem from boredom and a search for cheap thrills. American missionary Maji witnessed a young farmer who had sustained severe burns on his upper body. After the soldiers demanded money from him and he failed to comply, they doused him in kerosene and set him ablaze. Similarly, a young boy suffered horrific burns after he failed to lead a group of soldiers to his mama. People in the rural areas surrounding Nanjing faced danger from numerous directions. Not only were they potential targets for marauding Japanese soldiers, but they were also at the risk of bands of Chinese outlaws, who preyed upon the large influx of refugees on the roads and the few souls who remained at home despite the fierce conflict raging nearby. Maji encountered a 49-year-old woman whose home was invaded by bandits looking for money. When she and her husband said that they had none, they battered her head and breast with a stool and burned her feet until she revealed their savings of between $4 or $5. In the absence of a formal government, informal authority was often wielded by secret societies. For instance, the Big Sword Society reportedly offered protection not only against Japanese soldiers and local bandits, but also against small groups of Chinese troops seeking to escape back to their lines and resorting to theft for survival. Now that's a blast from the past, isn't it? When in doubt, the Big Sword Society always comes around. Rumors began to circulate in early January of 1938 that the Chinese army was preparing to retake Nanjing and that Chiang Kai-shek soldiers had already been spotted inside the city walls. Many of the small makeshift Japanese flags that had appeared outside the private homes in mid-December suddenly vanished, and some Chinese residents who had been wearing Japanese armbands hastily removed them. There was even talk of launching an attack on the Japanese embassy. Word spread that the Japanese were becoming frightened and they were searching for Chinese clothing to disguise themselves as civilians in the event of a retreat. In reality, none of this was true. The Chinese army was still reorganizing after the costly campaign that had forced it from Shanghai to Nanjing and then further into the interior. However, this did not imply that the Japanese had achieved complete control over the city. After 6 weeks of terror, Nanjing began to reassert itself. Japanese soldiers faced fatalities and injuries in skirmishes against members of secret organizations like the Big Sword Society or the Yellow Spears. After the new year, the population within the safety zone began to dwindle. A week into 1938, a number of refugees at Jilin College, which had peaked to around 10,000, fell to around 5,000. Less than a month after the conquest, many former residents started returning to their homes during the day and then coming back to the college at night. Still, the city was far from safe, and even those whose homes were located within the safety zone, Baltrim believed it was unwise to stay too far away from the refugee camp. A month after the Japanese forces had surged through its gates, Nanjing was a thoroughly devastated city, with fire still being set every day and night. By mid-January, estimates suggested that more than half of the city had been burned down. The main shopping district completely was gone, as well as the entertainment area surrounding the Confucius Temple. Nevertheless, slowly but surely, the shell-shocked city began to pull itself together and started the long process of renewal. Baltrim considered opening an industrial school offering a 4-month course for women to help compensate for the loss of labor resulting from the indiscriminate killing of men. The Chinese New Year fell on January the 31st of 1938. Celebrated throughout Asia, it was also recognized by the Japanese. It was a dismal, muddy day, and as many feared, soldiers who appeared too happy from excessive drinking attempted to enter the safety zone in search of women, but they were stopped. The sound of thousands of firecrackers filled the air, fulfilling the age-old purpose of scaring away evil spirits. Refugees in Rabe's compound presented him with a large red silk banner adorned with gold. There was a Chinese inscription upon it. His Chinese friends translated the message for him. "Rabe, you are a living Buddha for 100,000 people." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my podcast series found on major podcast platforms. Hey, if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to my exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. December of 1937, the Battle for Nanjing left its residents in terror as the Japanese army advanced. Following the invasion, a horrific massacre began, with thousands targeted in brutal killings, torture, and humiliation. Civilians and soldiers alike were indiscriminately slain, and the Japanese military showed no mercy. To this day, the Nanjing Massacre stands as a testament to the unbelievable evil man holds within.